There are moments on television that live forever, not because of jokes told or films promoted, but because something real slips through the cracks. It doesn't happen often, but when it does, it shakes late-night culture to its core. This is one of those moments. It all started like any other night on Jimmy Kimmel Live. The band played, the lights warmed the faces of a buzzing audience, and backstage, a Hollywood legend adjusted his cufflinks in the green room. Steve Martin, icon, comedian, actor, writer, was the night's main guest. Promoting his new comedy special, he was expected to bring charm, nostalgia, and a few light laughs. But things wouldn't go as planned, not even close. Steve walked out to thunderous applause. Wearing a tailored charcoal suit and a dark blue shirt that contrasted perfectly with his snow-white hair, he waved to the crowd, gave Jimmy a quick handshake, and took his seat. "Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for the incomparable Steve Martin," Jimmy announced. "Thank you. Thank you," Steve said, his tone polite but cool. Jimmy smiled. "So, new special coming out. What's it like being funny for 50 years straight? Must be exhausting." A light laugh from the crowd. Steve smirked. "Not as exhausting as being asked the same question for 50 years. Jimmy raised an eyebrow, chuckled, and leaned forward. "All right, we're starting spicy. I like it." But Steve wasn't smiling. "Not really." "I mean, it's a fair question," Jimmy continued. "You've seen comedy change. Hell, you've changed it. But you've also said some controversial stuff lately. Tweets, interviews. You've ruffled feathers. Would you like me to continue polishing the next 5 paragraphs?" You said, "Yes." ChatGPT said, "Perfect. Here's the next polished section." Steve crossed his legs. "And let me guess, your producers gave you a list of all the wrong things I said so you can play Inquisitor tonight." The audience laughed nervously. Jimmy blinked. "Well, I just think people are curious, Steve. I mean, you've joked about cancel culture. You said modern comedy has become too cautious. You can't expect not to be asked." Steve stared at him. "No, I expect to be asked. I don't expect to be ambushed." The tension in the room thickened. Jimmy tried to lighten it. "Come on, man. You're Steve Martin. You could say anything and still be America's favorite white-haired treasure." Steve didn't flinch. "And maybe that's the problem." Gasps from the front row. Even the band shifted uneasily. "Would you like me to continue with the next 5 paragraphs?" You said, "Yes. Make sure the length should." Same ChatGPT said, "Got it. I'll keep the length the same while fixing grammar, punctuation, and flow." "Here's the next polished section." Jimmy's grin faltered. "Look," Jimmy said, "I'm not trying to trap you. I just want to talk." Steve leaned forward, voice colder now. "Then why are your questions more about headlines than my work?" Jimmy tried to pivot. "Let's talk about the special. What inspired it?" Steve nodded. "Finally, a real question. It's about getting older, feeling invisible, and trying to stay relevant when younger voices dominate the culture." Jimmy smiled again, relieved. "Ah, the existential dread of aging and showbiz. Relatable. Should I continue with the next 5 paragraphs?" You said, "Yes." ChatGPT said, "Here's the next polished section, keeping the length intact and only correcting grammar, punctuation, and flow." Steve didn't laugh. "But maybe you wouldn't know about that, Jimmy. You're still pretending to be the cool guy with a desk." Laughter turned into silence. The crowd didn't know whether to clap or cringe. Jimmy's expression hardened. "You know what, Steve? I've interviewed a lot of comedians. Most of them don't need to punch their host to feel tall." Steve stood slowly. "Then maybe you should book fewer comedians and more sick offense." The producers panicked. Security moved into the wings. Jimmy stood too. "If you don't want to have a real conversation, you can leave. Would you like me to continue with the next 5 paragraphs? You said, yes. ChatGPT said, here's the next polished section, with grammar, punctuation, and flow fixed while keeping the length the same. Steve buttoned his jacket gladly. He turned to the audience. Thanks for the memories. Don't believe everything you laugh at. He walked off stage. The applause was scattered, confused, and Jimmy sat back down, visibly rattled, rubbing his temples. He had just clashed with a titan, and it was only part 1. What viewers didn't see after the commercial break was that Steve Martin hadn't actually left the building. Backstage, a quiet storm was brewing. A producer pleaded with Steve to return, insisting they could steer the segment back on track. The show was tanking live, and ratings gold was slipping through their fingers. Steve stood firm at first, arms crossed, jaw clenched. Then he turned to the producer and said, "Fine, one more round, but I talk. He listens. Should I continue with the next 5 paragraphs? You said, yes." ChatGPT said, here's the next polished section, carefully corrected while keeping the length intact. Moments later, Steve re-entered the set. The crowd gasped. Jimmy Kimmel, now visibly caught off guard, stood up again. "Oh, back for an encore insult." Steve didn't sit. "No, I came back to make something clear since the jokes got lost under your ego." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Jimmy gestured to a chair. "Please enlighten us." Steve ignored the invitation to sit. "You know, Jimmy, it used to be that hosts ask questions to learn something. Now they just want to make headlines. And you're a master of pretending to be deep while staying safe." Jimmy snapped back. "And you're the master of pretending your bitterness is wisdom. Would you like me to continue with the next 5 paragraphs? You said, yes." ChatGPT said, here's the next polished section, corrected for grammar, punctuation, and readability while keeping the length the same. Gasps, a few claps, mostly stunned silence. Steve leaned on Jimmy's desk, eyes locked. "What I said about comedy being too cautious, it's true. People are scared to offend, scared to risk. And you're the face of that fear dressed as satire." Jimmy pointed a finger. "You're just mad people stopped laughing at old man jokes." Steve's voice lowered. "No, I'm mad comedy stopped being dangerous, and that hosts like you, safe, marketable, advertiser-friendly, act like they're still part of the resistance." The audience didn't know what to do. It was no longer a talk show. It was a duel. "Would you like me to continue with the next 5 paragraphs? You said, yes." ChatGPT said, here's the next polished section, fixed for grammar, punctuation, and clarity, while preserving the original length. Jimmy walked around his desk, getting closer. "Steve, you want to talk danger? You're a millionaire with a Netflix deal. You don't know risk. You know." Steve stepped forward too. "And you know scripts, teleprompters, focus groups. You're not a comedian, you're a brand." Security tensed. The band had stopped playing. Studio lights dimmed slightly as a producer signaled to cut to commercial. Jimmy raised a hand. "No, let it run. I'm not afraid of airing this," Jimmy declared. "You want honesty? You got it." Steve shook his head. "Too late. This isn't honesty. This is ego with a laugh track." "Would you like me to continue with the next 5 paragraphs? You said, yes." ChatGPT said, here's the next polished section, carefully corrected while keeping the full length and tone intact. Jimmy exhaled sharply, jaw tight. "Then get off my stage." Steve turned to the crowd. "One more thing before I go." He walked to center stage. "Comedy dies when the truth becomes offensive, and hosts who fear the truth shouldn't be allowed to pretend they're in on the joke." The audience gasped. Some clapped. Others didn't move. Jimmy nodded to his crew. "All right, enough. Security." A guard stepped forward. Steve raised a hand. "I'll walk." He left again, this time slower, steadier. "Would you like me to continue with the next 5 paragraphs?" You said, "Yes." ChatGPT said, "Here's the next polished section, grammar and punctuation corrected, while keeping the length the same." Jimmy turned back to the camera. "We'll be right back, maybe." The show ended in chaos, but the real storm began just moments later online. Within minutes of Steve Martin's explosive exit, hashtags like Steve Eyes, Jimmy Hack, Comedy Crisis, and Late Talk Show Meltdown were trending worldwide. Twitter was ablaze with polarized takes. Some praised Steve for speaking truth to sanitized comedy, while others blasted him for ego-driven disrespect. Clips of the confrontation racked up millions of views on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram within the hour. Fan accounts spliced together the most volatile moments, while political commentators used the incident as a launchpad for debates about cancel culture, free speech, and generational divides. Meanwhile, inside Jimmy Kimmel's production offices, panic spread like wildfire. ABC executives demanded emergency damage control meetings. Publicists crafted statements. The producers issued a vague social media post. Tonight's segment sparked passionate discourse. We respect all voices and are reviewing the situation. Would you like me to continue with the next 5 paragraphs? You said, yes. ChatGPT said, here's the next polished section with grammar and punctuation corrected while keeping the length unchanged. Steve Martin, on the other hand, released a single tweet. Comedy is dead when everyone's laughing but no one's thinking. Tonight was a funeral. It went viral in seconds. News outlets picked up the story overnight. Meltdown on Kimmel read Variety. The night Steve Martin declared war on late night, wrote Rolling Stone. Even SNL made a parody skit of the altercation by the weekend. But beyond headlines and memes, there were consequences. Kimmel's show saw a dip in ratings the next night, but rebounded slightly with viewers tuning in just in case. The drama continued. Meanwhile, Steve was booked on 3 podcasts within 24 hours, all eager to capitalize on the fallout. Would you like me to continue with the next 5 paragraphs? You said, yes. ChatGPT said, here's the next polished section, corrected for grammar, punctuation, and flow while keeping the full length. Privately, Jimmy was livid. I've done thousands of interviews, he vented to staff, and the one time I push back, I get painted as the villain. His team urged him to let it go, but Jimmy wasn't built for silence. On the following episode, he opened the monologue not with jokes, but with a direct response. I don't apologize for asking tough questions, but I do regret inviting someone who only came to fight. That, predictably, reignited the fire. Steve posted a black and white video to Instagram. You regret inviting me, Jimmy? I regret staying as long as I did. Would you like me to continue with the next 5 paragraphs? You said yes. ChatGPT said, here's the next polished section, with grammar and punctuation corrected while keeping the length the same. The public feud now had its own life, a digital wildfire impossible to contain. Commentators dissected it. Comedians chose sides. Audiences stayed glued. In the weeks that followed, both men tried to return to business as usual. But something had changed. The illusion of late-night comfort had cracked. The smile behind the desk and the guest in the chair would never be quite the same. And for a brief moment, millions had watched. Not a performance, but a reckoning. Would you like me to continue with the final part? You said, yes. ChatGPT said, here's the final polished section with grammar, punctuation, and flow corrected while keeping the length intact. What do you think? Who was out of line, Steve or Jimmy? Drop your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more behind-the-scenes showdowns.